Welcome. You have found your way to Boring Boris, History Sleep Stories. My name is Nathan, and it is my honor to be your guide tonight. Before our journey begins, allow yourself to settle in. Find that perfect position of comfort and stillness. Let your muscles soften, your shoulders relax, and take a slow, deep breath in and gently release it. Let the noise and the worries of your day begin to fade like distant echoes in a quiet hall. Tonight, our journey takes us back in time. We travel not to the grand arenas or the opulent palaces of emperors, but to the very heart of the Roman world, its streets. We often imagine Rome in the bright, unforgiving light of the sun, gleaming with marble and bustling with life. But what happened when the sun went down? What secrets were held in the flickering torchlight of its narrow alleys? What whispers were carried on the cool night air through its cobblestone avenues? The streets of Rome were more than just paths from one place to another. They were a complex, living system with a hidden life all their own. So, quiet your mind. There is nothing else you need to do. Simply listen as we walk together and uncover the secrets of ancient Rome's streets on our path towards a deep and peaceful sleep. When you imagine the city of Rome, you may first picture the shining marble of its great monuments. The Colosseum with its towering arches, the Pantheon with its perfect dome, or the vast sweep of the Forum filled with columns. These were the images that emperors and poets wanted the world to remember. Yet beyond those familiar landmarks lay the ordinary streets where most Romans lived and worked. To understand the city, you must walk not only through the marble, but also through the dust. The main avenues of Rome were paved with heavy stones, uneven and worn from centuries of traffic. They echoed with the iron rims of carts, the hooves of horses, and the sandals of thousands of feet. Between the paving stones, dust collected in summer and mud in winter. The smell was never neutral. It was a mix of smoke from cooking fires, the sharp tang of animal dung, and the sour odor of waste tossed from windows. A Roman street was not a place of silence or peace. It was alive, crowded, and relentless. As you moved away from the famous squares, the streets narrowed quickly. High apartment blocks, known as insulae, crowded together so tightly that only a strip of sky could be seen between them. Laundry lines stretched across from one building to another. Children leaned out of windows, shouting to friends below. The upper floors creaked with the weight of too many residents. In some cases, entire families lived in a single room with no fresh air or light. These insulae were the true face of the city, housing the majority of its million inhabitants. The street below was a theater of daily life. Bakers sold loaves still warm from communal ovens. Butchers carved meat beside piles of scraps that drew stray dogs. Street sellers shouted prices of olives, garum, or cheap wine. Beggars sat near the doorways asking for coins, while pickpockets searched for easy prey among the distracted crowds. The voices of hawkers blended with the clang of blacksmiths at their forges and the chants of water carriers bringing buckets from the public fountains. Travel through these streets was not easy. Rome's laws once tried to forbid heavy carts during the day because of the congestion, but the rule was widely ignored. Wagons and animals pressed against pedestrians at every corner. There were no pavements in many areas, so people stepped aside into doorways to avoid being crushed. At night, the situation grew even more dangerous. Without streetlights, only a few torches or lanterns lit the way. Shadows stretched across the walls, and every corner offered the threat of thieves. To walk home after dark was a gamble that many tried to avoid. Yet amid the dust and danger, there was also vitality. Rome was a place where the world gathered. Merchants from Africa, the Near East, Gaul, and Britain passed through the same streets as senators in white togas. Languages mixed in the air. You could hear Latin, Greek, and dozens of regional dialects. Shops displayed goods from across the empire: silk from the east, ivory from Africa, amber from the north. The streets of Rome were not just local passageways. They were the veins of an empire, pumping wealth and people through its heart. Still, the glory was for the few, and the burden was for the many. For the poor, the street was both a lifeline and a trap. It was the only place to earn a living, to socialize, or to find entertainment. But it was also filled with hazards. Fires spread easily through crowded blocks, and when buildings collapsed, rubble buried entire families. Diseases lurked in the dirty water that pooled between the paving stones. The roar of the crowd could lift a beggar for a moment, but abandon him just as quickly. To the wealthy visitor arriving from the provinces, Rome seemed overwhelming. The monuments inspired awe, but the side streets revealed a less comfortable truth. Behind the polished marble lay endless rows of dusty alleys. These alleys told the story of how most Romans lived, shoulder to shoulder in cramped quarters, surviving in a city that cared more for its image than its comfort. This contrast between marble and dust, grandeur and grime, was the essence of Rome's streets. As you finish this first walk, imagine the feeling of standing at a crossroads. One path leads toward the shining facade of the Forum, where politics and ceremony dominate. The other disappears into a narrow alley, where the smell of refuse is strong and the walls close in. Both belong to the same city. Both shaped the lives of its people, and both reveal the secret of Rome's streets, that behind the beauty of empire lay the ordinary struggle of daily existence, carried out in dust, noise, and shadow. If the monuments of Rome were its public face, then the insulae were its private reality. These towering apartment blocks lined the narrow streets and housed the vast majority of Rome's people. They were the background to daily life, rising high above the noise and dust of the city. The shadows they cast shaped not only the streets, but also the lives of those who lived within them. An insula was not a palace. It was a structure built for necessity, not for beauty. The ground floor often held shops or taverns, where bakers sold bread and innkeepers served cheap wine. Above these shops, stacked floor upon floor, were the living quarters. The wealthiest residents rented the lower rooms, where stone walls provided some stability and a private entrance. The poorer citizens climbed wooden staircases to reach the upper floors, where rooms were small, ceilings low, and the risk of collapse always present. Life inside an insula was crowded. A single room might hold an entire family, their bedding rolled up each morning to make space for cooking or work. There was no running water. Residents carried buckets up from the street or relied on communal fountains. There was no private sanitation. Waste collected in jars or pots, often emptied from windows into the alley below. The air inside was thick with smoke from cooking fires and the smell of unwashed bodies. In summer, the heat became unbearable, and in winter, the damp walls offered little protection from the cold. Noise was constant. Children cried, mothers scolded, traders argued over debts. From dawn until late at night, sounds traveled easily through thin walls and open windows. Privacy was rare. Every cough, every quarrel, every whispered prayer could be overheard. In this world of shared space, survival demanded tolerance, but the pressure of too many lives squeezed into too little space created tension. Fights broke out over water, food, or even the right to hang laundry in the best spot for sunlight. The greatest fear of all was fire. Insulae were built quickly and cheaply, often from wood and rubble. Oil lamps lit the rooms, and cooking fires burned on simple braziers. One overturned lamp or spark could ignite an entire building. Flames would race upward through wooden staircases, trapping families before they could escape. Collapses were just as deadly. Heavy rains or weak foundations caused walls to crack and fall. Roman writers spoke often of the sudden ruin of insulae, burying dozens beneath the rubble. For the poor who lived high above the street, safety was never guaranteed. Yet despite these dangers, the insulae were full of life. They were microcosms of Rome, each building a small community. Within their walls, neighbors shared food, news, and gossip. Children played in the corridors, running down to the streets to join the chaos outside. Women exchanged stories as they fetched water from nearby fountains. Men gathered in taverns on the ground floor to drink and talk politics. A stranger entering an insula could feel the pulse of the city more directly than in any marble forum. The insulae also revealed the sharp divide between rich and poor. On the lower floors, wealthier tenants enjoyed larger rooms, sometimes with a small balcony or access to a courtyard. They could afford better furnishings and perhaps a servant to fetch water. Above them, families lived in cramped lofts, with ceilings so low that adults could barely stand upright. The higher the floor, the cheaper the rent, and the greater the risk. This vertical hierarchy of housing mirrored the social order of Rome itself. For those who lived in the shadows of the insulae, survival required resilience. Every day meant climbing steep staircases, carrying water, avoiding disease, and hoping that the building would not betray them. And yet these structures endured for centuries, multiplying across the city until they defined its skyline. From a distance, the monuments of Rome caught the eye, but up close, it was the insulae that shaped the horizon. Imagine standing in a narrow alley with insulae rising on both sides. The sky is a thin strip above. Laundry hangs like banners between the walls. Voices echo down, mingling with the smell of bread from a shop below. In this space, you feel the true Rome. Not the Rome of emperors and generals, but the Rome of ordinary people who lived in crowded rooms, laughed with their neighbors, feared the sudden blaze of fire, and carried on despite the risks. These were the shadows cast by the insulae, long and dark, but filled with the warmth of human persistence. To understand the streets of Rome, you must imagine how they changed with the passing of each hour. The city was never still, yet its character transformed between the brightness of day and the shadows of night. In the eternal city, light and darkness were not only a matter of nature, but also of safety, fear, and daily rhythm. At dawn, the streets began to stir. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the insulae, creeping downward into the alleys. Shopkeepers opened their shutters. Bakers stoked their ovens, sending warm bread smells into the air. The cries of hawkers soon followed, selling fruit, vegetables, and cheap wine to early customers. Light at this hour meant energy and renewal. The sun revealed every crack in the walls, every pile of refuse, but it also gave people courage to step out into the crowded lanes. By midday, the city glared with brilliance. The white stone of temples and public buildings reflected the sun fiercely, making the air seem hotter and brighter. Dust swirled on the main roads as carts and animals moved constantly. Vendors shouted over one another, and the press of bodies seemed endless. The Forum, the heart of public life, dazzled in sunlight, filled with togas as citizens discussed politics and business. Light here symbolized order and authority, a reminder of Rome's claim to greatness. Yet this light also revealed the city's flaws. In the full heat of day, the stench of waste and the closeness of the crowds became unbearable. Shadows were scarce, and those who could afford it escaped indoors. For the poor, the midday sun brought exhaustion. Roof tiles radiated heat into the upper floors of insulae, turning rooms into ovens. Windows without glass let in dust and noise. In these conditions, light became not a blessing but a burden, an oppressive force that pressed on body and spirit. As evening approached, the light softened. Long shadows stretched down the streets. Markets closed, and families gathered in their cramped rooms to share meals of bread, porridge, or beans. Public fountains grew busier as people fetched water for the night. The sound of conversation drifted from doorways, blending with music from taverns. This was the gentlest light of Rome, a brief interlude before darkness. Then night arrived, and with it the true transformation of the city. Rome had no system of street lamps, only torches at public buildings or lanterns at the doors of wealthy homes provided points of brightness. Most alleys were left in near total darkness. Travelers carried small oil lamps, but the flickering flames gave little protection against the shadows. Darkness emboldened thieves and gangs who prowled the streets. Without the order of daylight, fear replaced confidence. For those living high in the insulae, night brought another kind of anxiety. Fires, invisible during the day, could suddenly break out. A dropped lamp or overturned brazier sent smoke rising through stairwells. Families slept lightly, listening for shouts that warned of flames. The absence of light meant danger, and every creak of wood or sudden sound stirred unease. Still, darkness was not only a threat, it was also a time of intimacy. Families shared stories by lamplight, neighbors whispered secrets across thin walls, and lovers met in quiet corners. Taverns glowed warmly with laughter and drink. The poor found escape from daily burdens in the music of flutes or the rhythm of dice games. In this way, darkness softened the harsh glare of day, creating a more private Rome hidden from the eyes of officials and emperors. For visitors, the shift from light to darkness was startling. By day, Rome impressed with its scale and brightness, its marble and monuments. By night, the same city became a maze of uncertainty, a place where the torchlight showed only fragments of reality. Streets that seemed crowded and lively at midday turned dangerous and silent, broken only by sudden cries or the clatter of hooves on stone. This cycle of light and darkness defined the rhythm of life in the eternal city. To live in Rome was to move constantly between the security of day and the uncertainty of night. Every dawn promised renewal. Every noon revealed the city's contradictions. Every evening softened the edges, and every night tested the courage of its people. The streets carried both radiance and shadow, reminding all who walked them that Rome was not only the city of marble triumphs but also the city of hidden fears. The streets of Rome were built on contradiction. They were the pride of an empire and yet the burden of its people. They dazzled with marble but reeked of refuse. They displayed power but revealed poverty. To walk through them was to witness both the glory and the misery of Rome, side by side, never fully hidden from one another. On the one hand, Rome wanted the world to see its grandeur. Triumphal arches lined the main avenues, carved with scenes of conquest. Senators in white togas processed through the forum, flanked by guards. Temples stood open with columns gleaming in the sun, their steps crowded with worshippers. To a visitor arriving from the provinces, these sights proclaimed that Rome was eternal, powerful, and rich beyond measure. This was the intended image of the city, carefully cultivated by emperors who knew the value of spectacle. But only a turn away from those monuments, another Rome appeared. In the alleys behind the temples, beggars crouched with outstretched hands. Children played barefoot in filth, chasing each other around piles of refuse. Laundry dripped from the upper floors of insulae, darkening the walls with streaks of water. The same streets that carried the steps of senators also carried the tired feet of slaves, laborers, and migrants who struggled each day to survive. The contradiction extended even to sound. In the great theaters, audiences applauded tragedies and comedies, their voices echoing across stone seats. Yet in nearby taverns, drunkards shouted and brawled, their laughter spilling out into the streets. The same city that cultivated poetry and philosophy also rang with the coarse songs of soldiers and the cries of street vendors. Rome was a place where refinement and vulgarity coexisted so closely that they became inseparable. Even the smells told two stories. The perfume of incense burned in temples drifted into alleys heavy with the odor of dung and rotting food. Bread fresh from ovens tempted the hungry, but the same street held the stench of waste poured from windows. The city could not hide its dual nature. Every pleasant scent was pursued by an unpleasant one, every comfort shadowed by discomfort. For the wealthy, contradiction was a matter of choice. They could walk through the marble arcades, attend baths, and dine in villas decorated with mosaics. But when they needed to cross the city, they too faced the same muddy streets and crowds. A senator might be carried in a litter to avoid the press of bodies, but even from behind curtains he would hear the shouts of traders and smell the smoke from cooking fires. Rome forced its contradictions on everyone, no matter their rank. The poor experienced these contradictions more directly. They worked in the same city that celebrated grandeur but rarely enjoyed its benefits. A laborer who hauled stone for a new temple might pass that same building later, barred from entry. A woman who sold vegetables in the market stood in the shadow of monuments built by emperors, she would never meet. To live in Rome was to exist in constant contrast between personal struggle and public magnificence. These contradictions shaped the character of the people. Romans learned to accept noise, filth, and crowding as facts of life. At the same time, they carried pride in their city's power and reputation. To complain about the streets was easy, but to imagine living anywhere else was difficult. Rome was harsh, yet it was also the center of the world. Its contradictions bound its people together, forging resilience and adaptability. When you reflect on the streets of Rome, picture both sides. See the arches, temples, and forums where glory was displayed. Then turn into the narrow lanes where shadows hung and smells lingered. Both were real, both necessary, and both inseparable. The greatness of Rome did not exist without the grime of Rome. The contradiction was not a flaw but a defining feature of the city. Thus, the streets held their secret truth. They reminded every citizen, whether rich or poor, that Rome was built on opposites: splendor and squalor, order and chaos, reverence and vulgarity, all shared the same space. To live there was to walk a line between beauty and misery each day. And it was in this uneasy balance, in these everyday contradictions, that the eternal city truly revealed itself. At its height, Rome was home to more than 1 million people, making it the largest city the ancient world had ever seen. To grasp that number, imagine streets not simply busy, but overflowing with humanity at every hour. Rome was not a place where one could retreat into silence. It was a city that pressed against its inhabitants from all sides, a living organism fueled by constant movement, noise, and density. The first impression a newcomer had was the sheer crush of bodies. Streets built centuries earlier for carts and small crowds were now filled far beyond their limits. Pedestrians squeezed shoulder to shoulder, often jostled by wagons that forced them against walls. Markets spilled over into alleys, stalls blocking passages, sellers shouting for attention. Even the broad avenues laid out by emperors quickly became choked with activity. The sense of congestion was inescapable, and with it came the psychological strain of never finding open space. Housing mirrored this congestion. Insulae rose skyward, packed with tenants who lived in rooms scarcely larger than storage closets. Families shared walls so thin that every word from a neighbor could be heard. Staircases groaned under the daily passage of hundreds of feet. Privacy was rare, quiet, rarer still. In such conditions, tempers flared easily, but so did community. The crowding forced people into constant contact, shaping bonds as well as conflicts. The Forum, the symbolic heart of the empire, was one of the most crowded spaces of all. Here, senators debated, merchants struck deals, and citizens gathered to hear proclamations. Yet beneath the grandeur, the daily reality was chaos. Petitioners swarmed officials, lawyers argued cases in loud voices, and pickpockets prowled the edges of the crowd. The Forum promised order, but delivered cacophony. To stand there was to feel the pulse of Rome as an endless thrum of voices and footsteps. Public entertainment drew even greater crowds. The Colosseum, capable of holding tens of thousands, filled with spectators whenever games were announced. To reach it, streams of people clogged the surrounding streets, their excitement adding to the chaos. When the games ended, the crush of bodies leaving the arena was so intense that accidents were common. The same happened at the Circus Maximus, where hundreds of thousands gathered to watch chariot races. These spectacles displayed Rome's power, but they also magnified its crowding into overwhelming force. Water and food, essential to life, became scenes of congestion in themselves. Public fountains served entire neighborhoods, forcing residents to line up with buckets. Grain distribution, a critical part of feeding the poor, drew massive queues that stretched along the streets. Tempers often rose as supplies ran short or officials delayed. In these moments, the city's size revealed its fragility. Rome could feed its people only through careful organization, yet disorder always lurked close by. This density shaped the soundscape of Rome. Day and night, noise never ceased. Vendors hawked goods. Hammers rang from workshops. Carts clattered over paving stones. Dogs barked, and voices merged into a constant roar. Roman writers complained often of the impossibility of sleep in such conditions. For the wealthy, villas outside the city walls offered escape, but for the majority there was no relief. The crowded heart of Rome beat loudly, without pause. Psychologically, the pressure was immense. To live in Rome meant accepting that space was never your own. Crowds pressed into homes, markets, baths, and temples. Even worship was rarely private, as shrines and sanctuaries filled with people. For some, this constant contact created resilience. For others, it bred exhaustion and irritation. Modern cities know this same effect. But for ancient Romans, it was intensified by the lack of escape. Yet, the crowd also gave Rome its strength. From the press of bodies came the sense of being part of something larger, a city that drew people from every corner of the empire. The streets might be suffocating, but they were also filled with opportunity. A new arrival could vanish into the crowd, find work, or hear news carried from distant provinces. The congestion was not only a burden, but also a source of energy that made Rome the hub of the known world. To picture Rome at its most real, imagine yourself in the middle of a street, pressed on every side, voices ringing in your ears, the smell of bread and sweat in the air. You cannot move freely, but you feel the life of the city surging around you. This was the crowded heart of the empire, overwhelming, yet irresistible. A place where grandeur and suffocation merged into one unbroken experience. If there was one thing impossible to ignore in Rome, it was the noise. The city was never silent, not even in the depths of night. Its streets carried the sounds of labor, commerce, and survival, all woven together into a restless symphony that echoed across stone walls and narrow alleys. To live in Rome was to live inside a constant chorus, a soundscape that shaped every waking hour, and even disturbed hours meant for rest. From the first light of dawn, the city began to stir. Bakers opened their ovens, the crack of firewood echoing through courtyards. Water sellers shouted as they filled buckets at public fountains. The cries of market traders soon followed, each voice raised above the others in desperate competition. Olives, fruit, bread, cheap wine, fish pulled from the Tiber, all announced with rhythmic chants designed to be heard over the chaos. By mid-morning, the streets were filled with overlapping calls that made conversation almost impossible. Animals added their voices to the mix. Horses clattered across paving stones, pulling carts that groaned beneath heavy loads. Donkeys brayed as they hauled baskets of grain. Chickens, goats, and dogs wandered freely, filling alleys with their own sounds. The combined noise created an unbroken hum that seemed to shake the city itself. Roman writers complained that even indoors there was no escape, for walls were thin and windows open to the air. Noise belonged to everyone. Workshops amplified the clamor. Blacksmiths struck iron on anvils, the ringing of hammers carrying far down the streets. Potters shaped clay, the scrape of tools mixing with the splash of water. Leatherworkers, carpenters, and stonecutters all added their part. Each trade had its rhythm, but together they produced a discordant orchestra of labor. For the poor who lived above these shops in cramped rooms, the sounds were constant companions. Day blended into night with little relief. Public places magnified the din. In the forum, debates and trials filled the air with oratory. Lawyers shouted to be heard, petitioners begged, and crowds murmured in response. Senators attempted dignity, but their voices joined the chaos of merchants and bystanders. In the theaters, actors projected their lines while the audience jeered or applauded. At the Circus Maximus and the Colosseum, cheers and screams rose in waves, drowning out all else. Entertainment in Rome was always loud, for the crowd itself was part of the performance. Traffic was another source of endless noise. Although laws once forbade heavy carts during daylight, enforcement was weak. Wagons rumbled along, their wheels grinding against stone. Drivers cracked whips and shouted commands. Pedestrians shouted back in frustration as they were forced aside. At night, when carts were officially permitted, the clamor grew worse. Wheels screeched, animals brayed, and voices echoed through otherwise dark streets. For those trying to sleep in insulae, the sound was unbearable. Many complained that rest was impossible in such a city. Night brought different sounds but never silence. Taverns came alive with laughter, drunken songs, and arguments that often turned violent. Music spilled out from flutes, drums, and the plucking of strings. Street gangs roamed, their footsteps sudden and threatening. Dogs barked in alarm, sometimes all through the night. The absence of daylight did not quiet the city. It only shifted the tone from commerce to revelry and danger. For the wealthy, there were ways to escape. Villas outside the city walls offered retreats where birdsong replaced the roar of traffic. Inside Rome, however, noise was the inescapable price of living at the center of empire. Even in the homes of the rich, sounds from the street drifted in through courtyards and open roofs. To experience true quiet often meant leaving the city altogether. The sounds of Rome carried more than irritation. They also told its story. Every cry of a trader marked the presence of commerce. Every clang of a hammer spoke of industry. Every cheer in the arena echoed the passions of its people. For better or worse, the noise was proof of Rome's vitality. The city lived through its sounds, even if those sounds robbed its citizens of sleep and peace. To imagine Rome, close your eyes, not to see but to hear. Picture the crash of cartwheels, the chant of sellers, the roar of a crowd, the endless barking of dogs. Feel how the noise presses on you, never lifting. This was the voice of the eternal city, a voice both magnificent and exhausting, a voice that never stopped speaking. If the monuments of Rome displayed its brilliance, its waste revealed its fragility. Beneath the polished surfaces of temples and forums, the city struggled with a problem as old as civilization itself. More than 1 million people lived, worked, and ate within its walls. What they consumed had to be replaced with clean water, and what they discarded had to go somewhere. Rome was proud of its aqueducts and sewers, but life on the streets showed how incomplete those solutions truly were. Fresh water entered the city through grand aqueducts, channels of stone that carried streams from distant hills. Their arches stood as marvels of engineering, feeding fountains, baths, and some private homes. Yet for most citizens, water meant long walks to public fountains, where queues formed from dawn until dusk. Buckets and jars clattered as women, slaves, and children waited their turn. The water was free, but access was slow. Arguments broke out over place in line, and at times the supply ran low, leaving tempers frayed. The fountains themselves became gathering points. People exchanged gossip, arranged trades, and listened for rumors carried from other districts. But with so many hands dipping into the same basins, cleanliness was uncertain. Spilled water turned streets into muddy patches, breeding insects and smells. Even the gift of water came with discomfort. Those wealthy enough to live in houses connected to private pipes enjoyed convenience, but most Romans carried heavy loads up steep staircases, praying not to stumble before reaching their door. If water was difficult, waste was worse. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, drained into the Tiber and was celebrated as a triumph of engineering. Yet it could not serve every alley and insula. Most buildings had no connection at all. Waste collected in chamber pots or jars, emptied daily by hand. Sometimes servants carried it to cesspits, but often it was tossed from windows into the street below. The result was filth that clung to cobblestones and spread its stench across entire neighborhoods. The combination of waste and water made walking through Rome an assault on the senses. Rain turned refuse into sludge, running down slopes toward lower streets. In summer, the heat intensified the odor until even citizens accustomed to hardship complained. Flies swarmed, and disease found easy passage. Roman satirists wrote with disgust about passers-by struck by the contents of chamber pots hurled from above. For the poor who lived on upper floors, this was daily reality. For the unlucky walking below, it was humiliation mixed with danger. Animals worsened the problem. Horses and donkeys left dung across the roads. Stray dogs and pigs tore into piles of refuse, scattering scraps. Even with slaves hired to sweep certain areas, the filth returned within hours. Official edicts tried to control waste disposal, but enforcement was uneven. The grand image of Rome required marble facades, not clean alleys. For most residents, the city was dirty because the empire chose spectacle over sanitation. Public baths added another contradiction. They used enormous amounts of water drawn from aqueducts to fill pools where citizens bathed. These places offered hygiene and relaxation to those who could pay a small fee. Yet, outside their walls, many neighborhoods lacked basic cleanliness. The same city that poured water into massive baths left families to struggle with contaminated streets. It was another reminder of how Rome's priorities favored display over daily comfort. The river Tiber carried both life and death. It provided water for some districts and served as a highway for trade. But it also received the outflow of sewers and refuse, turning stretches into foul-smelling channels. Floods spread that contamination back into the city, coating streets with silt and waste. To live near the river was to accept both its benefits and its dangers, for it could sustain or sicken with equal ease. For the citizens of Rome, waste and water shaped their days. They rose early to collect water, careful not to lose their place in line. They navigated streets where filth clung to sandals and stench filled the air. They washed in public baths, but returned home to insulae without sanitation. The grandeur of aqueducts and sewers existed, but the reality was less triumph than compromise. To imagine this world, picture yourself walking through a Roman alley after a summer rain. The stones are slick beneath your feet. The smell of rot and sewage rises with every step. A line forms at a fountain where tired faces wait for water. A slave passes carrying a bucket, careful not to spill. Above, a window opens, and you step quickly aside, wary of what might fall. This was the truth of Rome's waste and water, a truth hidden behind the arches of aqueducts, but present in every breath its people took. Among all the dangers that haunted the people of Rome, fire was the most feared. In a city built so densely, with wooden staircases and crowded homes stacked one above another, flames could spread faster than any person could escape. It was a terror that lingered in the minds of rich and poor alike, for fire did not respect social class. One careless spark, one overturned lamp, could destroy entire blocks and leave families with nothing but ashes. The design of the insulae made them especially vulnerable. These tall apartment blocks rose 5 or more stories high, constructed quickly to meet the demand of a growing population. Their walls were often a mixture of brick and rubble, their beams made of cheap wood. Oil lamps lit the rooms, while braziers provided heat and cooking fires. Every floor was a risk. A dropped ember or a gust of wind through an open window could turn necessity into catastrophe. Residents slept lightly, always alert to the crackle of wood or the smell of smoke. Roman writers describe how common these disasters were. Entire neighborhoods were scarred by repeated fires. The most infamous occurred during the reign of Nero, when flames raged for days, consuming temples, houses, and markets. The city rebuilt, but the memory of destruction remained. Even decades later, families told stories of relatives who had fled through smoke-filled streets, clutching children and few possessions, praying to survive. To combat this danger, Rome employed watchmen and fire brigades, but their effectiveness was limited. The night watch carried lanterns and patrolled the streets, listening for shouts of alarm. Buckets and pumps stood ready, but water was scarce, and narrow alleys blocked access for carts. When fire struck, citizens formed human chains, passing water from fountains to burning buildings. It was rarely enough. By the time help arrived, flames had often leapt from roof to roof, turning containment into desperation. For the wealthy, fire was a nuisance that threatened property. They built homes of stone with courtyards that slowed the spread of flames. Some kept slaves trained to douse sparks or remove valuables quickly. For the poor, however, fire meant total ruin. Insulae collapsed suddenly, burying entire families beneath rubble. Survivors faced homelessness, forced to sleep in the streets or seek refuge in temples. With little savings, most never recovered what they lost. Fear of fire shaped daily habits. Families stored their most precious belongings in baskets, ready to be carried at a moment's notice. Parents warned children never to play with lamps. Neighbors listened for unusual sounds at night, for the first crackle might be their only warning. Even celebrations carried risk. Festivals with torches, fireworks, or crowded feasts often ended in disaster when flames spread unchecked. Joy and destruction walked side by side. Yet Rome did not stop building upward. The demand for housing was too great, and landlords sought profit by adding more floors despite the danger. Laws tried to limit the height of insulae, but enforcement was weak. Fire remained a constant shadow. Each new tenant understood that their home could vanish overnight, replaced by smoldering ruins. In this way, fear became part of ordinary life, accepted because there was no alternative. The psychological weight of this fear cannot be overstated. Imagine lying awake in a small room, hearing neighbors shift restlessly above you, smelling smoke from a tavern below. Was it safe? Or was it the beginning of disaster? Each sound might signal danger. Each flicker of light outside the window might be a growing blaze. Sleep in Rome was never entirely peaceful, for the fear of fire lingered in every mind. To picture the streets under fire, imagine the night sky glowing red, smoke rolling between rooftops, people rush into alleys, carrying children, shouting names, dragging possessions behind them. Flames climb higher, sparks falling like rain. The roar of burning timber drowns all other sounds. Fear spreads as quickly as the flames themselves, consuming the city with the knowledge that what was safe yesterday is gone today. This was the truth of Rome, a city of greatness and fragility. Its monuments stood for centuries, but its homes burned again and again. Fire was not a rare disaster, but a constant presence, an enemy always waiting. And so the people of Rome lived each day with the knowledge that safety was temporary and fear was never far from their doors. If the insulae were where Romans slept, the markets were where they truly lived. The marketplace was the beating heart of the city, a maze of stalls, carts, and shouting voices that spilled into every alley. To walk through Rome meant passing one market after another, each one promising food, goods, or distractions, but each one also hiding its own dangers. The central forum held the grandest exchanges, where senators and merchants met under the shadow of temples. Here, deals were made for land, grain shipments, or political favors. But beyond the marble arcades, the real life of commerce thrived in the smaller markets, the ones that served ordinary people. These markets had no statues or monuments. They were crowded lanes filled with smoke from grills, the smell of salted fish, and the cries of vendors eager to sell before their goods spoiled. Food was everywhere, though not always safe. Butchers displayed cuts of meat under the open sky. swarmed by flies. Fishmongers laid out their catch on wooden boards, hoping to sell quickly before the sun spoiled it. Bread sellers carried baskets from communal ovens, shouting to draw customers. Vegetables, beans, and fruit from the countryside crowded tables, their freshness fading by midday. There were no standards of cleanliness, no inspections, only trust or suspicion. A bargain might fill a family's stomach, or it might bring sickness within hours. Noise was constant. Each vendor shouted in a rhythm designed to stand out, repeating the same phrases until they became part of the city's soundtrack. Buyers haggled loudly, often drawing small crowds. Beggars hovered at the edges, hoping for scraps. Children darted between stalls, their laughter mingling with the bleating of goats tied nearby. To enter the marketplace was to surrender to chaos, a swirl of voices and movement that swallowed every sense. Markets also reflected Rome's diversity. Merchants arrived from distant provinces, bringing olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, dates from North Africa, and spices from the East. Foreign accents mixed with Latin, turning the markets into living museums of empire. Yet this variety came at a cost. Imported goods were expensive, reserved for the wealthy, while the poor relied on cheap bread or porridge. Even in the abundance of the market, inequality was on display. The shadow economy thrived here as well. Stolen goods appeared in hidden corners, sold quickly before officials noticed. Gambling dens operated behind curtains, drawing desperate men with promises of easy winnings. Prostitution, though officially regulated, found its customers in the maze of alleys leading off the market. For every honest trade, there was another transaction made in secrecy, another deal whispered in the shadows. Sanitation was nearly absent. Waste from animals mixed with spilled wine, trampled vegetables, and the remains of fish. The ground grew slick, and the air grew heavy. Rats and stray dogs scurried to snatch whatever was left behind. Diseases spread easily in this environment, carried by insects, food, or the sheer crush of bodies. Shoppers accepted these risks because there was no alternative. To eat meant to face the hazards of the marketplace maze. Yet the markets were also places of community. Neighbors met to exchange gossip. Families gathered to share small meals bought from vendors. Street performers entertained crowds with juggling, music, or tricks. Religious festivals brought extra stalls and decorations, turning the ordinary chaos into celebration. In these moments, the market became more than a place of survival. It became a stage where the city expressed itself, noisy, colorful, and unrestrained. For the poor, the market was both opportunity and trap. A coin might buy a loaf of bread to feed a family for the day, but that same coin might be stolen before it reached the baker. For the wealthy, the market was entertainment, a place to taste exotic flavors or show off fine clothing. Everyone, rich or poor, had to pass through its lanes eventually. No Roman could ignore the marketplace, for it was the source of life itself. To imagine the marketplace, picture yourself standing in a narrow street lined with stalls. The smell of fresh bread competes with the stench of spoiled fish. A vendor waves figs in your direction while a beggar tugs at your sleeve. Voices clash in the air until they blur into a single roar. Every step brings new sights and sounds. every corner another distraction. This was the marketplace maze of Rome, dazzling and dangerous, the true mirror of the empire's crowded heart. The phrase bread and circuses has echoed through history as a symbol of how Rome kept its restless masses under control. Grain distributions and grand entertainments gave the poor just enough to survive and just enough distraction to forget their hardships. Yet behind this promise of nourishment and spectacle lay a contradiction that defined life in the city. Rome could feed the people with bread and thrill them with games, but it could not guarantee them clean water or a healthy environment. Grain was the lifeline of the poor. Each month, citizens lined up at distribution points to receive their ration. The lines stretched down streets, filled with the chatter of neighbors and the frustration of long waits. Officials handed out sacks of wheat, measured carefully, enough to bake bread for a household. For many families, this free grain meant the difference between survival and starvation. Without it, the crowded poor would have rioted. With it, they endured. But grain alone did not make a balanced diet. Families baked coarse loaves, filling but heavy, often eaten with little more than beans or onions. Meat was a luxury, fish expensive, and fruit seasonal. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them vulnerable to illness. Yet the people were told to be grateful, for Rome provided their bread, even if the rest of their meals lacked variety or nutrition. Hunger was quieted, but health was not secured. Entertainment offered the other half of the promise. The Colosseum hosted games of blood and spectacle, where tens of thousands cheered for victory or death. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew even larger crowds, the roar of voices rising like a storm. These circuses gave the people excitement, a break from the monotony of daily struggle. For a few hours, a laborer or beggar could sit among thousands and feel part of something larger than themselves. Bread kept them alive, and circuses gave them joy. Yet while Rome poured resources into grain and games, it neglected the most basic need of all, clean water. Aqueducts carried streams into the city, supplying fountains, baths, and wealthy homes. But contamination was common. Water mixed with refuse, pipes corroded with lead, and fountains overflowed into muddy streets. Floods spread filth from the Tiber back into neighborhoods. Even when water flowed, it was not always safe to drink. Illness followed, moving silently where bread could not reach. The contradiction was visible in daily life. Citizens might leave the Circus Maximus still buzzing from the thrill of a race, only to walk home past open sewers and piles of waste. They might collect their grain ration with relief, then draw water from a fountain already polluted by countless hands and containers. The same empire that built marvels of engineering allowed its people to drink from sources that carried disease. Rome's priorities favored spectacle over sanitation. Baths added another layer of irony. Public bathhouses gleamed with marble pools and steaming rooms, open to citizens for a small fee. They were symbols of Roman hygiene and culture, celebrated as places of relaxation and health. Yet the water that filled them came from the same aqueducts that delivered to fountains. It was often reused, cloudy with dirt and sweat, shared by hundreds each day. Illness spread easily in these spaces that promised cleanliness. The poor bathed beside the rich, but the relief of washing did not erase the danger that lurked in the water itself. Officials understood the importance of bread and circuses for public order. They invested heavily in grain supply and entertainment, for these kept unrest at bay. But water, invisible once it flowed, lacked the same political value. A full stomach and a cheering crowd mattered more than unseen germs or future illness. In this way, Rome's greatness revealed its blindness. It could conquer nations and build monuments, yet it stumbled at providing the most basic foundation for health. To walk the streets of Rome was to feel this contradiction at every step. You might clutch a loaf of bread, grateful for food, but thirst forced you to drink water that tasted of metal or decay. You might shout with joy at a gladiator's victory, only to return home to a family weakened by fever. Bread and circuses soothed the surface of life, but beneath it, the struggle for health never ended. Picture the city with its crowds streaming toward the arena, the smell of fresh bread drifting from ovens, the fountains trickling into worn basins. Now add the unseen truth, tainted water, disease, and fragile bodies. This was Rome's hidden story, where survival depended not only on grain and spectacle, but on luck against illness. Bread and circuses might feed the spirit, but without clean water, the body remained at risk. Disease was an invisible companion on the streets of Rome. It lingered in the crowded air of insulae, drifted from the refuse in alleys, and spread silently through water and food. The city's size, which made it the pride of the empire, also made it a breeding ground for sickness. Rome was not only a center of power and wealth, it was also a city where illness pulsed constantly, shaping the lives of its people in ways both seen and unseen. Crowding was the first cause. With more than 1 million inhabitants pressed into close quarters, diseases spread with terrifying ease. A cough in one insula could become an epidemic within days. Children, already weakened by poor diets, were especially vulnerable. Fevers carried through entire families, leaving parents desperate and helpless. In narrow alleys, where neighbors leaned from windows to talk across the street, contagion leapt from one household to the next with barely a pause. Sanitation worsened the danger. Waste tossed from windows collected in the streets, mixing with rainwater and animal dung. Flies swarmed over filth, carrying sickness to markets where food lay exposed. Rats thrived in the refuse, spreading plague and fear. Roman writers often mocked the stench of the city, but beneath their satire lay a grim truth. The smell of Rome was not only unpleasant, it was the smell of disease waiting to strike. Water, celebrated through aqueducts and fountains, became another pathway for illness. Contamination from sewers or lead pipes poisoned what should have been life's purest source. Families had no choice but to drink, cook, and wash with water that carried unseen dangers. Stomach ailments, fevers, and long illnesses followed. Even the baths, where citizens sought cleanliness, became reservoirs of contagion. Hundreds shared the same pools, carrying germs back to their crowded homes. The markets added their own risks. Meat spoiled quickly under the hot sun, fish rotted within hours, and fruit carried insects from distant farms. Buyers could rarely tell what was safe and what was dangerous. A single bad purchase could bring sickness to an entire family. Yet hunger drove people to take the risk, for survival left no alternatives. The abundance of the market was shadowed by the threat of disease in every basket. Medical care was uneven. The wealthy could hire physicians, some trained in Greek traditions, who prescribed diets, herbs, or surgery. The poor relied on charms, prayers, or advice from neighbors. Healers sold potions in the streets, their mixtures promising cures but often bringing more harm than good. Amulets against fever hung around children's necks, offering hope if not protection. For most citizens, disease was not something to cure but something to endure. Epidemics swept through the city more than once. Ancient sources describe waves of plague that emptied streets and filled pyres with the dead. The empire survived, but each outbreak left scars on families and neighborhoods. Memories of sudden death haunted the living, a reminder that sickness could return at any moment. Fear of disease was constant, even in times of apparent health. Yet, Romans carried on, adapting as best they could. They washed in fountains, burned incense to drive away bad air, and prayed to gods for protection. They whispered stories of curses or divine punishment, searching for meaning in their suffering. Illness became part of the rhythm of life, accepted with resignation. To be Roman was to live in the shadow of both greatness and fragility, where monuments stood eternal, but human bodies weakened easily. Imagine walking through a Roman street with this awareness. You hear the laughter of children, but you also notice their thin frames and pale faces. You see baskets of food, but you know some of it will bring sickness before nightfall. You drink from a fountain, but the taste of metal lingers. The city feels alive, yet beneath that energy runs another current, steady and dangerous, the pulse of disease. Rome called itself eternal, but its people knew otherwise. They lived each day between vitality and weakness, strength and vulnerability. The monuments endured, but human lives flickered quickly, snuffed out by illness that never ceased to circulate. This was the hidden truth of the eternal city, that its heart beat not only with triumph and power, but also with the unending rhythm of disease. In the crowded city of Rome, health was not a right shared equally. It was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and powerful, while the majority faced life with little more than luck, folk remedies, and endurance. This division shaped every aspect of daily survival. For the few who could afford it, the city offered doctors, private baths, and diets designed to preserve strength. For the many, sickness was endured in silence, and the risk of death was ever present. Physicians, often trained in Greek traditions, served the rich. They studied anatomy, prescribed herbs, and experimented with diets. Wealthy families hired them as household attendants, ready to treat injuries or advise on illnesses. These doctors were not always successful, but they represented access to knowledge and care that the poor could only imagine. A senator's child might be examined carefully, given medicines, and surrounded with attention. A poor child in an insula received none of these protections, and many did not survive infancy. The baths became another marker of privilege. Public baths welcomed citizens for a small fee, offering hot rooms, cold plunges, and steam. They were places of social gathering as much as hygiene. Yet even here, inequality was clear. The wealthy visited daily, moving through pools of marble, attended by slaves who carried oils and towels. The poor came less often, sometimes only when they had spare coins, and shared crowded pools where cleanliness was questionable. For them, the bath was a rare luxury, not a daily habit. Food and diet divided the city further. Wealthy Romans dined on variety: meat, fish, fruits, and imported delicacies. Physicians often prescribed foods as cures, believing balance in diet was the foundation of health. Meanwhile, the poor lived on bread, porridge, beans, and the occasional scrap of meat or fish. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, leaving them more vulnerable to disease. The same empire that imported spices and silk from distant lands left its poorest citizens to survive on little more than wheat and water. When sickness struck, the poor turned to charms and prayers. Amulets against fever hung from children's necks. Herbs were brewed into simple teas, passed down by tradition rather than science. Neighbors advised one another, sharing remedies born of necessity. Temples offered rituals to the gods of healing, with prayers left on altars in exchange for hope. These practices gave comfort, but they rarely cured. For many families, survival meant enduring the illness rather than defeating it. The wealthy, however, could withdraw from danger. When plagues swept through the city, they fled to country villas, leaving the crowded poor behind. In fresh air and open land, they escaped the worst of contagion. The city's majority had no such option. They remained in insulae where disease spread unchecked, burying their dead quickly and returning to work because life had to continue. The contrast was stark. For the few, illness was an inconvenience. For the many, it was a constant threat. Accidents revealed the same divide. A wealthy man injured in the arena as a spectator might summon physicians to treat him with bandages and ointments. A laborer injured in construction had no such care. He might be carried home, tended by family with rags and water, left to heal slowly or die. Rome built monuments that inspired the world, but it did not build systems to protect the health of its laborers. The city cared more for stone than for flesh. This imbalance left a mark on Roman society. Life expectancy for the poor was short. Children often died young. Mothers faced danger in childbirth, and men worn down by labor aged quickly. The wealthy lived longer, their bodies sustained by better diets and occasional medical help. But even they were not safe from epidemics. Disease ignored class at times, sweeping through palaces and insulae alike. Still, privilege bought time, comfort, and greater chances of survival. Imagine standing in a Roman street, watching the contrast unfold. A senator passes in his litter, healthy and well-fed, attended by servants carrying medicines and oils. At the same moment, a woman crouches in an alley, comforting a sick child with only whispered prayers. Both live in the same city, both walk the same streets, yet their access to health could not be more different. This was the hidden truth of Rome. Its greatness stood on a foundation of inequality. Health belonged to the few, while risk weighed on the many. The monuments of marble promised eternity, but the bodies of ordinary people told another story: fragile, vulnerable, and always at the mercy of chance. The monuments of Rome have long been admired for their scale and beauty. The Colosseum, the aqueducts, the baths, and the temples stand as proof of the empire's engineering genius. Yet behind every arch and column lay the sweat of countless laborers. Stone was carved, lifted, and set in place not by emperors, but by the hands of men, women, and slaves who bore the weight of Rome's ambition. The price of construction was not measured only in gold. It was measured in lives worn down by endless toil. The process began in the quarries. Massive blocks of marble and limestone were cut from mountainsides with hammers, chisels, and wedges. Dust filled the air, coating the skin and lungs of workers. The sound of metal striking stone rang out from dawn until dusk, a rhythm of exhaustion. Slaves and convicts performed much of this labor, chained together, watched by guards. Injuries were constant crushed fingers, broken bones, falls from heights. Few who worked in the quarries expected long lives. From the quarries, the stone traveled to the city. Carts creaked under its weight, pulled by oxen along rutted roads. Workers strained to keep the loads balanced, for a single slip could overturn the wagon and kill those nearby. When rivers offered transport, barges carried blocks downstream, but even then, the effort of loading and unloading demanded sheer force. Every monument began not with inspiration, but with years of back-breaking transport, each stone a burden that consumed lives. In the city, masons and builders took over. Skilled craftsmen shaped blocks with precision, carving details that still astonish. Yet even for the skilled, the work was grueling. Heat from the sun baked open construction sites. Dust choked the air. Ladders and scaffolding swayed as workers hauled materials upward. Accidents were frequent, and few safety measures existed. If a worker fell, there was no system of aid, no compensation for families left behind. The project continued, indifferent to the cost. The Colosseum itself stands as a monument to this price. Tens of thousands of slaves labored for years to build it, cutting and placing massive stones, assembling arches that towered over the city. The grandeur that awed spectators was built on bodies that no one recorded. Their names vanished, but their sweat remains in every block of travertine. When crowds cheered gladiators within the arena, they rarely thought of the laborers who had raised the walls. Smaller projects demanded no less sacrifice. Roads, fountains, and aqueducts all required steady labor. The aqueducts, stretching for miles, consumed forests for scaffolding and quarries for stone. Bridges rose over rivers through sheer force of human effort. Every improvement to the city's image demanded more from those who had the least. Rome's strength was carved from the exhaustion of the anonymous. The burden extended beyond the laborers. Families of slaves and workers bore the absence of loved ones, sometimes permanently. Injuries left men crippled, unable to provide for households already living on the edge. The empire celebrated its triumphs in marble, but the quiet suffering of its builders remained unacknowledged. The city valued results, not the lives that produced them. For the wealthy, monuments represented glory. They donated funds, saw their names inscribed, and accepted applause. For the poor, monuments represented more work, more risk, and more strain. The grandeur that impressed visitors was for them another reminder of how far they stood from comfort. Every arch was a triumph, but every triumph was also a tomb for the sweat and strength of the laboring class. Imagine standing at a construction site in ancient Rome. The sun beats down, dust rises in clouds as hammers strike stone. Men shout commands, ropes creak, and blocks swing precariously into place. A worker wipes sweat from his face, then returns to lifting. He knows he will never see his name carved into the marble he shapes. His legacy is silent, hidden within the stone itself. Yet without him, there would be no monument, no Rome to admire. This was the true cost of construction, the endless grind of labor that supported the empire's image. The Colosseum, the aqueducts, the temples all rose not only from the vision of emperors, but from the sacrifice of countless ordinary lives. Rome measured its greatness in stone, but the weight of that stone fell first upon the backs of its workers. Behind the stone monuments of Rome stood another resource that shaped the city's destiny: wood. Timber was the hidden foundation of the empire. It fueled fires, built scaffolding, supported roofs, and framed ships. Without it, Rome could not have risen. Yet the demand for wood was insatiable, and the forests that once surrounded the Mediterranean shrank steadily under the empire's hunger. What seemed abundant at first became scarce, leaving behind dust and barren hillsides. Every construction project demanded timber. Scaffolding rose around temples and amphitheaters, thousands of beams lashed together to hold stone in place. Floors and ceilings in insulae relied on wooden planks, often cut thin to save cost, making them fragile and prone to collapse. Roofs across the city required endless supplies of timber, replaced often after fire or decay. Even the aqueducts, with their arches of stone, used wooden centering frames during construction, discarded once the stone was set. Each arch in Rome carried a hidden history of forests cut to build it. Beyond buildings, wood fed Rome's constant appetite for heat and light. Families cooked meals over small braziers fueled by charcoal. Bakeries consumed vast amounts of fuel each day to bake bread for thousands. Bathhouses, always in need of hot water, burned piles of logs to keep furnaces glowing. Metal workers, potters, and smiths demanded steady flames to craft their goods. Every workshop, every kitchen, every bath relied on fuel that could only come from trees. Ships consumed even more. Rome's navy required timber for hulls, masts, and oars. Merchant vessels, too, depended on steady supplies of strong wood. Forests near the sea vanished as shipyards cut relentlessly. Inland, trees fell for roads, bridges, and carts. The reach of Roman power extended only as far as its wood supply could stretch, and by the height of the empire, much of that supply had already been stripped. The cost to the environment was severe. Hills once covered in oak, pine, and cypress became bare. Without roots to hold the soil, rains washed fertile earth into rivers, leaving dust behind. Streams dried up, fields lost their richness, and harvests grew smaller. Farmers complained that the land no longer yielded as it once had. Villages near quarries and shipyards watched their forests vanish, replaced by erosion and silence. Deforestation also altered daily life in the city. The price of fuel rose as wood became harder to obtain. Poor families struggled to keep warm in winter or to cook meals without spending precious coins. Wealthy citizens secured steady supplies through their estates, but the majority endured cold nights and half-cooked food. The empire's hunger for grandeur left its poorest citizens paying the price in discomfort and scarcity. Writers of the time noticed the change. Some praised Rome's power to reshape nature, boasting of lands cleared and mountains conquered. Others warned of the danger, describing rivers that once flowed strong now reduced to trickles. They saw that the forests, once vast, could not last forever. Yet the city's demands never slowed. Each new project, each new expansion required more trees, and the forests had no time to recover. For the ordinary Roman, the loss of forests was felt not in distant landscapes, but in daily routines. A woman carrying firewood paid more for a smaller bundle. A craftsman at his forge found his charcoal weaker, his flames less steady. A family shivered through cold nights, unable to afford enough fuel. The monuments glowed in marble, but behind them, countless homes grew darker and colder. Imagine walking through the countryside beyond Rome, where once tall trees stood, only stumps and dry earth remain. The sound of birds is gone, replaced by the creak of carts hauling wood from ever farther away. The horizon looks emptier, stripped bare by the city's endless appetite. In the distance, you see the city rise, shining in the sun, unaware or unwilling to see the price it has demanded from the land. This was another hidden truth of Rome. Its greatness consumed not only human labor, but the very earth itself. The forests turned to dust, and with them, the balance of nature shifted. The empire celebrated its monuments, but behind their stone faces lay hills stripped bare, rivers weakened, and soil exhausted. The cost of glory was carved not only in marble, but also in the silence of vanished forests. Among Rome's greatest achievements, the aqueducts stand as symbols of genius. They carried water across valleys and hills, feeding fountains, baths, and private homes. To later generations, they seemed proof that Rome had mastered the problem of supplying a vast city. Yet hidden in this triumph was a quiet danger, one that crept into every household: the use of lead. Pipes, cooking vessels, and storage jars made from lead turned water, the source of life, into a slow poison. Lead was valued because it was easy to shape. The soft metal could be rolled into sheets, soldered, and bent into pipes of any size. Roman engineers found it perfect for distributing water throughout the city. Wealthy families ordered private connections of lead pipe, marked with stamps of their names to show ownership. Taverns and bathhouses used it for cisterns and tanks. Even everyday utensils, from cups to cooking pans, were often made of lead. Convenience and status came at the price of health. The effects of lead poisoning were not understood in Rome, though some observers noticed patterns. Writers commented on the pale, sickly appearance of certain citizens. Others remarked on headaches, weakness, or trembling hands. These were the symptoms of exposure, though no one connected them to the pipes and vessels in common use. To Romans, water from the aqueducts seemed a gift from the gods. Few questioned whether that gift carried hidden harm. Modern science suggests the danger was real. Water flowing through lead pipes absorbed traces of the metal, especially if the supply was acidic. Cooking in lead pans released more poison into food. Over years, small amounts built up in the body, affecting the nervous system, damaging organs, and causing infertility. Children were most vulnerable, their growing bodies weakened by exposure. Families who prided themselves on their fine lead pipes may have unknowingly poisoned themselves with every drink. The poor, ironically, may have faced less risk. They fetched water from public fountains or wooden buckets with fewer lead connections. Their vessels were often made of clay rather than metal. Yet, even they were not safe. Bathhouses and taverns used lead storage tanks, exposing all who visited. No class escaped completely, for the poison was spread through the very infrastructure that defined Rome's greatness. The presence of lead also marked another contradiction of the city. Rome could raise aqueducts that spanned miles, marvels of stone and calculation, yet it overlooked the danger of the very pipes that carried the water. The empire invested in spectacle and efficiency, but ignored long-term well-being. The result was a city that looked strong yet carried weakness in its veins. Imagine the daily ritual of drawing water in a Roman home. A servant fills a jug from a lead pipe, pours it into a cooking pot, and sets it over a brazier. The family drinks without hesitation, proud of their supply. Children sip, soldiers quench thirst, elders wash their hands. No one notices the invisible threat that seeps slowly into their bodies. Hours later, the same family may feel fatigue or stomach pain, but they blame food, weather, or fate. The true cause remains hidden, silent, and persistent. Some Romans suspected the truth. A few writers claimed that clay pipes were safer, that lead carried harmful qualities, but such warnings were rare and easily ignored. The empire was too vast, the demand for convenience too strong. Lead was cheap, easy to work, and widely available. It was the practical choice, and practicality outweighed caution. The poison spread not because no one noticed, but because no one listened. Over centuries, the effect of lead accumulated. Generations drank from tainted sources. Their health slowly eroded. It did not destroy Rome by itself, but it weakened its people in ways unseen. The marble monuments endured, but the citizens who built and admired them carried the cost in their bodies. Strength on the outside, fragility within that, was the legacy of lead in the water. To imagine this hidden danger, think of the aqueducts stretching proudly across the countryside, their arches gleaming in the sunday. Then follow the water into the city, through pipes of soft metal, into kitchens and baths. Each drop carries life, but also a trace of poison. It is a contradiction that defines Rome itself. Brilliance joined to blindness, progress shadowed by risk. The empire gave water to its people, but in the same gift, it delivered harm. Rome's greatness was carved from stone and fueled by conquest, but it was also rooted in the soil. The fields surrounding the city once offered grain, olives, and grapes in abundance. Hillsides were green, rivers full, and valleys fertile. Yet centuries of exploitation turned this richness into ruin. The empire demanded too much from the land, and the land eventually gave too little in return. Behind the marble of the city lay a countryside slowly stripped of life. The pressure began with population. 1 million mouths inside the city required steady grain. farms near Rome worked constantly, ploughing the same fields year after year without pause. Without rotation or rest, soil lost its strength. Crops grew weaker, yields shrank, and farmers struggled to keep up. Fertile earth turned dry and thin, unable to recover. Families who once relied on local harvests now depended on imports from distant provinces. The fields of Africa, Sicily, and Egypt became Rome's breadbasket, while the land around the city withered. Deforestation worsened the problem. Hills stripped of trees lost their cover, leaving soil exposed. Rains washed topsoil into rivers, filling them with silt. Floods followed, damaging villages and fields. What had once been fertile slopes became barren, unable to hold crops. Farmers abandoned them, moving to the city in search of work. Their departure left the countryside emptier. The burden of feeding Rome shifted farther and farther away. Quarries and mines scarred the landscape further. Marble and stone removed from mountains left gaping wounds. Lead, copper, and iron mining polluted streams, killing fish and poisoning soil. Nearby fields turned unproductive, their waters tainted by runoff. Forests near quarries vanished, consumed for scaffolding and fires. The countryside bore the cost of the city's ambition, its scars hidden from the marble facades that tourists admired. Irrigation also carried risk. Aqueducts drained streams to feed the city, diverting water that once nourished farms. Local wells dried as channels sent supplies elsewhere. Farmers complained of thirst, their fields dustier each season. The empire celebrated aqueducts as triumphs of engineering, but for villagers cut off from their water, they were sources of hardship. Rome prospered while its neighbors suffered. The shift from small farms to large estates deepened the damage. Wealthy landowners bought exhausted plots and turned them into latifundia, vast plantations worked by slaves. These estates grew profitable crops for export, not food for local markets. Olives and grapes covered hills where once wheat had fed families. Grain for the city arrived from abroad, while the countryside around Rome became less capable of sustaining itself. Prosperity for the elite meant ruin for the small farmer, and with each generation, rural life grew more fragile. The environmental cost reached beyond economics. Birds and animals that once thrived in forests and fields vanished as habitats disappeared. Rivers carried less life, their banks eroded. Hills once green became brown and dusty, reflecting the sun like scars. Villages shrank or vanished, leaving ruins scattered across the countryside. The land that had sustained Rome for centuries became a wasteland in places, its fertility sacrificed to the empire's hunger. For the poor, the ruin of the land meant hunger and migration. Families left their farms, joining the crowded insulae of the city, swelling Rome's population and worsening its problems. Rural traditions faded, replaced by dependence on imported grain. A farmer who once worked his own soil now begged for bread in the forum. The countryside and the city were tied in decline, each suffering from the same imbalance. Imagine standing on a hillside near Rome. You look across fields once rich with wheat, now dry and cracked. A few olive trees cling to life, their roots struggling in poor soil. In the distance, you see the city shining with marble, its aqueducts stretching proudly. Yet around you, lies silence, broken only by the wind carrying dust. The monuments proclaim eternity, but the land beneath them tells another story, a story of exhaustion, loss, and ruin. This was the hidden truth of Rome's glory. The empire celebrated its strength, but its strength consumed the very earth that sustained it. Soil turned barren, rivers weakened, forests vanished. The ruin of the land was not sudden. It was slow, steady, and inevitable, a cost the empire ignored until it was too late. Rome's monuments survived the centuries, but the land that once fed them bore scars that never fully healed. To walk the streets of modern Rome is to feel two cities at once. One is the Rome of tourists, shining with marble and preserved ruins, where cameras click and guides explain ancient triumphs. The other is the ghost of the ancient city itself, still whispering from beneath the pavement. Every step across cobblestones carries echoes of those who lived there 2,000 years ago. The streets you see today are layered over their streets, and the contrasts are as sharp now as they were then. The great monuments remain, of course. Visitors gather at the Colosseum, marveling at its arches, or stand in awe inside the Pantheon. But beyond these wonders lie the smaller streets, where daily life continues. Cafes spill onto sidewalks, scooters roar past, and vendors sell trinkets beneath ancient walls. The sound of espresso machines and car horns mixes with the silence of stone ruins. It is a city where past and present crowd each other, never far apart. Yet as you walk, the ancient contradictions reveal themselves. The narrow alleys between tall buildings still feel much like the insulae of old. Laundry hangs from windows, voices echo between walls, and the sky above is only a narrow strip. The feeling of enclosure is the same, even if the buildings are newer. Rome remains a place where space is scarce, where people live close together, and where privacy is rare. The old congestion has not vanished, it has only changed shape. The smells, too, carry reminders. The aroma of coffee and bread drifts through the streets, but so does the scent of exhaust and garbage. In ancient times it was dung, smoke, and waste. Today, it is modern pollution. The balance is different, yet the effect is similar. The air tells the story of a city always alive, always crowded, always layered with both pleasure and discomfort. Tourists often admire the fountains, where clear water flows into marble basins. These fountains recall the ancient aqueducts that once sustained the city, but beneath the beauty lies continuity. Water still defines Rome, shaping its neighborhoods, drawing people to gather around it. In the past, fountains were crowded with citizens carrying buckets. Now they are crowded with visitors snapping photographs. The role has changed, but the scene remains. Walking the ancient streets today also reveals the endurance of disorder. Traffic snarls around the Colosseum, much as carts once jammed the Forum. Crowds surge through piazzas the way they once surged through markets. The roar of scooters replaces the clatter of iron wheels, but the result is the same. Rome is noisy, restless, and alive. Its energy has not faded. It has simply adapted to modern forms. For those who live in the city, these echoes are stronger. Residents navigate streets that still carry the weight of history. They shop in markets that recall the old maze of stalls. They climb narrow staircases in apartments, much like the insulae of the past. Their lives are not so different from those of ancient Romans, shaped by the same rhythms of crowding, noise, and scarcity of space. The marble monuments remain symbols, but the daily struggle continues in quieter, more ordinary ways. To see Rome with clear eyes is to recognize these layers. You may admire the Pantheon, but also notice the cracked walls of nearby buildings. You may photograph the Colosseum, but also step aside for traffic on streets too narrow for so many cars. You may toss a coin into the Trevi Fountain, but also smell refuse collected in bins along the alley behind it. Modern Rome, like ancient Rome, is a city of contrasts, splendor beside grime, beauty beside burden. Imagine pausing in a quiet moment on a side street. The cobblestones beneath your feet are modern, yet beneath them lie layers of older roads, worn by centuries of footsteps. The walls around you rise high, shutting out much of the sky. A faint breeze carries the sound of bells from a nearby church, mingling with the voices of tourists and residents. For an instant, the past feels present. You realize that the streets you walk today are not separate from the ancient ones, but are their continuation. This is the truth of Rome. To walk its streets today is to walk in two worlds. One celebrates history, preserving ruins for admiration. The other lives, daily life, filled with noise, smells, and contradictions. Together they form the eternal city, where past and present refuse to separate, and where every step is a reminder that glory and struggle always share the same ground. When we look at the ruins of Rome, it is tempting to treat them as a distant story, a chapter closed long ago. Yet the truth is more unsettling. The struggles of ancient Rome echo in the lives of modern cities. Congestion, pollution, and inequality were not left behind in history. They are patterns that return whenever human ambition outpaces human care. To walk through a modern metropolis is to hear the same echoes that once filled the streets of Rome. Start with the problem of crowding. Ancient Rome packed more than 1 million people into a space never designed for so many. Modern cities, though larger, repeat the same mistake. Towers rise higher, apartments shrink smaller, and families squeeze into limited rooms. Just as Roman insulae collapsed under their own weakness, today's crowded housing often suffers from poor construction and unsafe conditions. The materials have changed, but the experience remains familiar. For the majority, privacy is rare, space is scarce, and comfort is secondary to survival. The noise of Rome also lingers in our world. Carts and animals have been replaced by cars, buses, and trains, but the effect is the same. Streets roar with constant motion, voices fight to be heard, and silence becomes a luxury. In ancient times, Roman writers complained of sleepless nights caused by wagons passing through the city. Today, city dwellers write about the endless sound of sirens, engines, and construction. The city that never sleeps is not only New York or Tokyo, it was Rome first, and its echo continues. Pollution is another inheritance. Rome's streets stank of waste, smoke, and sewage. Today, the smells have changed to exhaust, chemical runoff, and industrial fumes, but the air remains heavy. Ancient Romans breathed smoke from fires that cooked their bread and heated their baths. Modern citizens breathe smog from factories and cars. In both cases, the marvels of progress carried hidden poisons. The glory of civilization came at the cost of health. Water tells the same story. Rome's aqueducts were a triumph, yet their pipes carried lead that poisoned generations. Modern cities deliver water through vast systems, but contamination still occurs. Lead pipes persisted into recent history. Polluted rivers flow past skyscrapers as surely as they once flowed past temples. Clean water, like in ancient Rome, remains unevenly distributed, reliable for some and uncertain for others. Even entertainment carries echoes. Rome offered bread and circuses to calm unrest, feeding the people while distracting them with games. Today, cities provide screens, stadiums, and endless spectacles. Crowds still gather, voices still roar, and governments still recognize the power of distraction. Bread may have changed into subsidies or food programs, circuses into sports or media, but the principle endures. Leaders learned long ago that hungry masses must be fed and restless masses must be entertained. Inequality may be the strongest echo of all. In Rome, the wealthy lived in villas with private physicians and fresh food, while the poor endured cramped rooms, disease, and hunger. In modern cities, skyscrapers rise above slums, hospitals serve the rich more swiftly than the poor, and diets still divide the privileged from the struggling. The technology has advanced, but the gap remains. Rome's shadow stretches into the present, reminding us that progress in stone and steel does not erase social imbalance. The environment bears scars in both ages. Rome stripped its forests and exhausted its soil. Today's cities drain rivers, level mountains, and pollute skies. The pace is faster, the scale larger, but the principle is unchanged. Human ambition consumes the land without pause, and the land gives way under the pressure. Rome shows us that environmental ruin is not a new story. It is an old one, repeated again and again. Imagine standing in a modern city at night. Neon lights glow, cars honk, people rush across crowded streets. Beneath this scene, if you listen carefully, you can hear the same pulse that beat in ancient Rome, the noise of crowds, the press of bodies, the tension between wealth and poverty. It is all familiar. The clothes, buildings, and machines are new, but the rhythm is old. Rome called itself eternal, and in a way, it was. Its mistakes survived as much as its monuments. Modern cities, from New York to Mumbai, from Cairo to Sao Paulo, repeat patterns first seen in Rome. The echoes remind us that progress is not always improvement. The marble of the past and the glass of today shine alike, but behind both lies the same question. How long can a city endure when its problems grow as fast as its pride? Rome loved to display its strength. Every triumphal arch, every marble temple, every colossal statue told the world that the city was eternal. The people of Rome believed they had mastered nature, conquered enemies, and built a society that could never fall. Yet beneath this confidence lay hubris, the pride that blinded them to their own fragility. The lessons of that pride still echo today, reminding us that greatness often hides its own undoing. The city's leaders focused on spectacle. They poured wealth into amphitheaters and baths, aqueducts and forums, while neglecting the basic needs of their people. Bread and circuses kept the poor content, but clean water, sanitation and safety were never guaranteed. The monuments endured, but the people suffered. This imbalance showed a truth Rome refused to face. Stone could not protect flesh, and spectacle could not replace security. Environmental ruin carried the same warning. Rome stripped forests, mined mountains, and drained rivers, believing the land would always provide. For centuries, it did. But slowly the soil weakened, the hills eroded, and the rivers choked with silt. By the time the damage was clear, the pattern was set. Rome had taken more than the land could give. Pride blinded the empire to the cost of its own success, and nature delivered the consequences. Public health revealed another form of arrogance. Romans believed their baths, aqueducts, and sewers proved their superiority. In truth, lead pipes poisoned families, dirty streets spread disease, and epidemics struck again and again. The empire ignored these flaws, proud of its engineering, unwilling to admit its limits. Hubris made them believe they were invincible. Illness proved otherwise. Social inequality carried perhaps the sharpest lesson. Rome glorified its wealthy elites, who dined in villas, enjoyed private physicians, and displayed luxury before the masses. Meanwhile, the poor lived in crowded insulae, vulnerable to fire, hunger, and plague. The gap widened, and resentment simmered. Yet the elite dismissed the suffering as inevitable, trusting that bread and games would keep unrest silent. In this, pride blinded them to the fragility of their own society. When pressure mounted, the empire cracked along the very lines it had ignored. The city itself reflected this arrogance. It was called the Eternal City, as if no time could touch it. Yet fires destroyed neighborhoods, invasions loomed, and decay spread within its walls. Eternity was an illusion, a dream created by those who believed themselves greater than history. The monuments still stand, but they remind us not of eternity, but of impermanence. The lesson for us is clear. Hubris is not only an ancient failing. Modern societies build towers that scrape the sky, highways that stretch for miles, and machines that move faster than any chariot. We pride ourselves on technology, comfort, and conquest of nature, yet the same dangers lurk. Cities struggle with pollution, inequality, and overcrowding. Forests vanish, rivers shrink, climates shift. Like Rome, we believe our systems are too strong to fail. Like Rome, we may learn otherwise. Imagine a Roman senator boasting of his city's greatness, dismissing the complaints of citizens about filth or hunger. Now picture a modern leader praising skyscrapers or satellites while ignoring poisoned water, exhausted land, or growing divides between rich and poor. The pattern is the same. Pride lifts the eyes to monuments while blinding them to the ground beneath their feet. Rome's hubris reminds us that no empire is eternal, no city invincible. Greatness carries a cost, and when that cost is ignored, decline begins. The Eternal City endured for centuries, yet it too fell. Its stones remain as a warning, whispering lessons to those willing to hear. They tell us that pride without humility, ambition without balance, leads not to glory, but to ruin. To walk through Rome today is to hear those whispers. The arches and columns still rise, but they speak less of triumph than of caution. They remind us that the monuments of power are also monuments of fragility. Hubris built Rome, but hubris also unmade it. The lesson is timeless, and it belongs not only to the past, but to every city that dares to believe itself eternal. When the noise of Rome finally faded each evening, when markets closed and fires burned low, the city entered its quietest hours. Yet even in this stillness, questions remained. The monuments stood in silence, but the streets whispered of the struggles hidden beneath their shadow. Rome, for all its brilliance, left a question behind, a question that still lingers for us today. What is the cost of greatness, and who must pay it? For the ordinary Roman, the answer was written in daily life. A father climbing the narrow stairs of an insula carried water on his shoulders, his strength spent before reaching his door. A mother baked coarse bread with the grain distributed by the state, grateful but weary of monotony. A child coughed in the night, his body weakened by illness from dirty water. These small struggles rarely appeared in the histories, but they were the true weight of the empire. Greatness was measured in monuments, but survival was measured in sacrifice. The city itself echoed the question. Its streets glittered with triumphal arches but stank of refuse. Its theaters roared with laughter, while alleys groaned with hunger. Rome promised eternity, yet lived in fragility. Every stone column cast a shadow, and in that shadow lived the people who bore the cost of empire. Their voices were quiet, but their suffering was constant. To walk those streets was to feel the contrast pressed into every step. At night, the contradictions became sharper. The Colosseum loomed dark, empty of crowds, its silence almost heavier than its roar. Taverns flickered with oil lamps, laughter spilling out into alleys where beggars slept on the ground. Fires glowed faintly in insulae, each one a reminder of the danger that never disappeared. The eternal city looked peaceful, but beneath the stillness lay fear. Fear of disease, fire, hunger, and collapse. Rome's pride never erased these truths. For the powerful, the question was easier to ignore. Senators dined in villas, drinking wine and discussing politics, confident in their status. Generals boasted of victories, emperors displayed their power, and the wealthy filled their homes with luxuries. To them, the price of greatness seemed small, for it was paid by others. Yet, history reminds us that even the mighty were not safe. Plagues entered palaces as easily as they entered insulae. Fires spared no district when they raged. Decline reached all classes in the end. The echoes of this question reach into our world as well. Cities today boast of skyscrapers, technology, and wealth, yet they struggle with the same problems: overcrowding, pollution, inequality, and fragile environments. We celebrate our progress, but we must ask, are we repeating Rome's mistakes with different tools and new materials? Are we too building monuments while ignoring the foundations that keep life healthy and secure? Imagine walking through Rome on a quiet night. The moonlight reflects on marble columns, while shadows pool in narrow alleys. You hear footsteps fade, a dog bark in the distance, the faint drip of water from a fountain. The city seems eternal, untouchable, yet you know that beneath the stone lies fragility, and beneath the silence lies unrest. Rome asks its question without words. How long can greatness endure when built on weakness? It is a question left not only for Romans, but for all who come after. The monuments survived, but the empire did not. The people endured for centuries, but their struggles consumed them in the end. The eternal city reminds us that eternity is not guaranteed. Power fades, pride blinds, and balance matters more than triumph. And so we are left with Rome's question in the night, not carved in stone, not shouted in arenas, but whispered in the silence of empty streets. The question lingers for us to answer. Will we learn from Rome's secrets, or will we, too, walk the same path, confident in our greatness, until the shadows close in? Rome called itself eternal, and its monuments still stand. Yet the streets beneath those monuments told another story. They were crowded, noisy, and filled with contradiction. They gave life to millions, but they also carried danger, filth, and fear. To understand Rome is not only to admire its arches and temples, but also to listen to the voices of those who lived in its shadows. The greatness of the city rested on fragile foundations. The forests it cut, the soil it drained, the pipes that poisoned, and the inequality that divided its people all left marks that marble could not hide. Rome thrived on spectacle, but survival was a daily struggle for most of its citizens. Their world was one of bread and circuses, but also of hunger and disease, of monuments that inspired awe but stood beside alleys filled with waste. And yet, there was resilience. Families carried water up endless stairs. Neighbors shared food and gossip in cramped insulae. Children played in the alleys, laughing despite the risks. Life persisted in the face of hardship. Rome's people endured even as their city strained against its own ambition. Today, when we walk among the ruins, it is easy to forget the ordinary lives that filled these streets, but the whispers remain. They remind us that cities are not eternal simply because they build in stone. They survive only when they balance pride with care, ambition with humility. Rome's secrets lie not only in its marble but in its dust. They ask us to see the whole city, its beauty and its burden, and to carry forward the lesson that greatness is fragile when it forgets the people who live beneath its monuments.